broke old man." He said it casually, like commenting on the weather as he speared another piece of steak. The words landed harder than the clink of his fork against the plate. Hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're watching this story. We were at the long oak dining table I'd bought 30 years ago, back when this house was filled with laughter, not judgment. My son leaned back in his chair, wine swirling in his glass, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Times change, Dad. You can't hold on to the past forever," he added, as though offering me fatherly advice. His wife chuckled, the sound thin and sharp, and their friends at the other end of the table glanced at each other, awkward but entertained. I didn't respond. I simply set my fork down, folded my napkin, and let the silence stretch. That was the moment I knew it was over. Not the meal, no, that would drag on another hour, but the illusion that my sacrifices had been seen or my worth remembered. By the next evening, he would be the one silent. I wasn't always the man people saw that night, sitting quietly wearing an old blazer and letting a younger man mistake my silence for weakness. My life, for better or worse, had been about building. Not just a career, not just a bank account, but a life worth handing over to the next generation. I started with nothing, and I mean nothing. When I was 19, my father passed suddenly. A heart attack at work in the middle of a shift. My mother worked part-time at a dry cleaner, her fingers raw from the steam press, but we barely kept the lights on. I dropped out of college after my first semester and took every odd job I could: warehouse loader, night security, delivery driver. Sleep became optional. Rent was not. I learned early that a man's worth wasn't in his words, but in his ledger. The quiet, invisible record of every bill paid on time, every debt honored, every promise kept. By 25, I had saved enough to start my own small contracting business. 2 trucks, 3 employees, and me, driving between job sites, paperwork balanced on the passenger seat, lunch often eaten while parked on the side of the road. The business grew because I refused to cheat a client even when it cost me. Word spread. We became the crew people called when the work mattered. I married at 32. Her name was Margaret. She had this way of looking at you that made you want to stand straighter, speak clearer, and be a better man. She didn't just believe in me. She made me believe in myself again. Our son David came 2 years later. I remember holding him in the hospital, his tiny fingers gripping mine with impossible strength, and thinking, this is why. Every hour I'd worked, every risk I'd taken, every sleepless night. It was all for the moment when I could give this boy a life without the fear of poverty that had haunted mine. From then on, my life was a steady rhythm of work, save, invest, repeat. I missed a few baseball games, I took phone calls at the dinner table, I fell asleep in my chair more than once. But every choice had a purpose. By the time David was 10, I had expanded into commercial construction. At 15, I signed my first 7-figure contract. At 18, I paid cash for the land where we built the house he grew up in. A sprawling place with a wide porch and a yard big enough for him to play football in. He had private schools, tutors, summer camps. When he wanted to learn piano, I bought a Steinway and hired the best teacher in town. When he decided on an Ivy League school, I wrote the check without blinking. Every time I told myself I was giving him something I never had: freedom. the freedom to choose his own path without worrying about the ground crumbling beneath him. Margaret passed when David was 24. Cancer, the kind that doesn't care how much money you've saved or how many prayers you say. I buried her on a cold March afternoon, and for the first time in decades, I didn't care about work. For months, I drifted. David visited now and then, but he was busy. New job, new girlfriend. I understood. Eventually, I returned to the office, but I began shifting my focus. I sold off parts of the business, invested in property, and diversified my portfolio. The years of work had paid off. I could retire comfortably, though I kept a hand in a few projects just to keep my mind sharp. David married at 30. His wife, Lauren, was polished, the kind of woman who never leaves the house without her hair perfect and her nails done. She smiled warmly enough, but there was something calculating in her eyes. She liked talking about vacations, home renovations, and networking dinners. I told myself it was just her way. The first time I noticed a shift was small. It was during a holiday gathering when David asked if I'd consider selling the old place so he and Lauren could buy something more modern. He framed it as helping me downsize, but I could see the gleam in Lauren's eyes when she talked about what they could do with the property. I laughed it off, told them I wasn't ready to part with the home yet. Then came the hints about my slowing down. They'd talk over me at family gatherings, correct me when I told stories, suggest I was forgetting things. Sometimes they'd glance at each other in a way that felt like an inside joke I wasn't in on. Still, I told myself they were just young. They hadn't seen enough of life to understand that a man's value isn't measured in how quickly he can quote stock prices or how many flights he takes a year. I kept showing up. Birthdays, anniversaries, dinners where I listened more than I spoke. I let them think I was fading into the background. What they didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that my so-called slowing down was deliberate. My business was sold, yes. My home was mortgage-free, yes. But the real engine of my life had shifted to investments, trusts, and accounts that ran quietly, invisibly, without needing my daily attention. By the time of that dinner, the one where my son would throw his little insult across the table, my personal net worth had quietly crossed the $50 million mark. Not because I needed that much, not because I wanted to flaunt it, but because I believed in the security it could buy. Not just for me, but for him, for his family, for my grandchildren. I had built it slowly, brick by brick, contract by contract, always thinking of him. And maybe that was my mistake. Because somewhere along the way, my son stopped seeing the man who built it all, and started seeing just another broke old man in a worn blazer. The night before that dinner, I'd been reviewing some quarterly reports in my study. Everything was in order. The accounts were growing. I was content. By the next night, I would start thinking very differently about what contentment really meant, and who deserved to benefit from it. Because once someone shows you what they truly think of you, you can never go back to seeing them the same way. It's strange how disrespect never arrives with a fanfare. It seeps in, quiet at first, almost harmless, like the first drip from a leaky faucet you keep meaning to fix. For me, the first drip came a few months after David's wedding. We were at a Sunday brunch they hosted at their new place, a modern, open-concept house in a gated community. Lauren had gone all out, sparkling mimosas, fresh pastries, smoked salmon laid out on silver trays. It was lovely, but the atmosphere carried a certain performance. Their friends were there, all around David's age, each one dressed like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. At one point, I was telling a story about a particularly difficult client from my contracting days, a man who'd insisted we rebuild his entire front porch 3 times because the wood grain didn't look right in the morning light. People laughed politely. Then David smirked and said, "Dad loves his war stories." It's like he's stuck in the 80s sometimes. A few chuckles followed. I forced a smile. "Well, the 80s paid for your college, son." It got a bigger laugh, but not from David. His jaw tightened. A small thing, just a drip. Another came the following month when I mentioned a property investment I'd been considering. David cut me off halfway through and said, "You know, Dad, maybe it's time to let a financial advisor handle that stuff. You've had a good run, but these days the market moves fast." I raised an eyebrow. "You forget, I was investing when you were still in diapers." He waved it off. "Yeah, but it's different now. Algorithms, data analytics. It's not like the old days." That was the second drip. The third came in the form of a misunderstanding. I'd given David access to one of my smaller rental properties years ago, a place near the city that I let him use for out-of-town guests or business associates. One day I got a call from my property manager saying the locks had been changed. When I asked David about it, he laughed. "Oh, that. Lauren thought it would be safer, you know, with all the crime downtown. But you didn't think to tell me?" I asked. He shrugged. "Didn't think it was a big deal." It was, not because of the locks, but because of the quiet assumption behind it, that my property was somehow his to manage as he pleased. Over time, the drips became more frequent, little comments about my clothes. "You still wearing those old jackets?" Or my car. "You could get something newer, Dad, you can afford it. For now." And then there was the trip. I'd offered to take them both to Italy, a place Margaret and I had dreamed of visiting but never did. David hesitated. "Dad, that's generous, but Lauren thinks maybe we should do something younger, like Bali or the Maldives." I said, "The offer was for Italy." He smiled thinly. "Maybe we'll go on our own sometime then." By now I was starting to see the pattern. Every interaction carried an undercurrent, an assumption that I was an outdated model of a man, a relic whose primary value lay in what could be extracted from him. The hardest part? Remembering the boy he'd once been. The boy who would run to the door when I came home late, wrapping his arms around my legs before I could even put down my briefcase. The boy who used to sit at the kitchen table while I worked, drawing blueprints for imaginary skyscrapers. That boy would be unrecognizable to the man who now spoke to me like a bank account on its last withdrawal. It wasn't just David either. Lauren had perfected the art of faint praise. "It's sweet how your dad still uses a flip phone," she told one of her friends once, as if I were an adorable museum exhibit. When I mentioned upgrading, she said, "Oh no, keep it. It's quaint." They thought I didn't notice, or maybe they thought I was too polite, too proud to respond. They weren't wrong, at least not then. I'd learned long ago that when people start underestimating you, the worst thing you can do is correct them. Better to let them keep their illusions. Let them relax, thinking you're exactly what they believe, while you watch quietly, patiently, waiting for the moment when the drip becomes a flood. That moment came sooner than I expected. One afternoon, David stopped by my house. He walked through the door like he owned it, barely knocking. "Dad," he began, "Lauren and I have been talking. This place, it's too much for you, the yard, the upkeep. It's time to think about selling and moving somewhere smaller." I said nothing, just watched him as he took a seat in my armchair. My chair. "And if you sold now," he continued, "you could gift us a good portion of the proceeds. We could invest it, grow it, make sure it stays in the family." I raised an eyebrow. "In the family?" "Yeah," he said, grinning. "You know, so it's not just sitting in the bank until, you know, until I die." He didn't say it, but the word hung in the air like smoke. I didn't argue. I didn't even tell him what the house was worth, or that the property values in the neighborhood were about to spike because of a new development project I'd quietly invested in years ago. Instead, I nodded. "I'll think about it." And I did think about it, long and hard. Not about selling, not about downsizing, about something else entirely, because by then I knew the flood was coming. And I intended to be the one to open the gates. It happened 3 weeks after that dinner conversation about downsizing. I had been spending more time in my study lately, combing through old ledgers, property files, and trust documents. Not because I was planning to make any major moves just yet, but because I liked knowing where every brick of my life's work was placed. That Saturday I had just returned from a morning walk when I noticed a sleek black car in my driveway. David was standing by the hood, sunglasses on, speaking into his phone with a tone that was all business. When he saw me, he waved me over. "Dad, got a minute?" I nodded, still catching my breath. He ended his call and got straight to the point. "So, I've been thinking more about what we talked about, the house." I said nothing. "I went ahead and spoke with a realtor. She's a friend of Lauren's. We can get you top dollar right now, probably even more if we stage it properly." I frowned. "You spoke to a realtor?" "Yeah, I figured we'd get the ball rolling. No commitment yet, just a conversation." But his eyes said otherwise. I walked past him toward the door. "David, this is my home." "I know, Dad," he said, following me inside, "but you've got to admit it's too big for you now. And the cash could make your life easier. You could travel, relax, not worry about maintenance. I'm just thinking about your comfort." I turned to face him. "And what would you do with my comfort exactly?" He hesitated for just a beat, long enough for me to see the truth. "Well, Lauren and I talked about maybe investing in some new properties. A bigger place for us, and we've got that startup idea I told you about. You could be an early investor." I studied him for a long moment. "An early investor in my son's house and side business. How generous of me." He smiled faintly, missing or ignoring the edge in my voice. That's when he said it. The sentence that slammed the door on whatever fragile trust still remained between us. "Look, Dad, I know you've done well for yourself, but things are different now. You're not exactly liquid. You've got assets, sure, but unless you cash out, you're just sitting on paper wealth. And let's be honest, you're not getting any younger. The smart move is to transfer what you've got before it's too late, Otherwise, it's just wasted potential. Wasted potential. The words rattled around in my head. The years of 4 a.m. alarms. The frozen winters spent hauling materials to job sites. The nights I drove home so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. The vacations I didn't take, the luxuries I didn't buy, the relentless push to make sure my son had every opportunity I never did. All of it. Wasted potential in his eyes. I sat down in my armchair, the leather creaking under my weight. David, I've given you everything I could. Everything. And now you're asking me to sign over my home, my savings, my security, because you think I'm… What? An old man who doesn't know what to do with his money? He raised his hands defensively. So no, I'm not saying that. I'm saying… You're saying, I interrupted, my voice low, that you think it's yours, that it's all just sitting here waiting for you to take it. His jaw tightened. Eventually, yeah. I mean, isn't that how it works? You can't take it with you, Dad. For a moment, I just stared at him. And in that silence, I understood something I wish I hadn't. My son didn't just feel entitled to my legacy. He believed it was already his. My role was simply to hand it over before I became inconvenient. The conversation ended when I told him I'd consider it, though we both knew my answer. He left with a tight smile, probably thinking he'd planted the seed. But the seed he planted wasn't one of agreement. It was one of resolve. That night I poured myself a drink and sat in the darkened living room replaying the scene. I could hear Margaret's voice in my head, soft but steady. Don't let anyone write the ending to your story but you. She was right, and I intended to make sure David learned exactly what that meant. 2 days later, the other shoe dropped. I received a call from my bank. The branch manager, an old acquaintance, sounded uneasy. Mr. Thompson, I thought you should know your son was in here this morning. I froze. David? Yes. He was asking a lot of questions about your accounts. He said he was helping you get organized and wanted to know about liquidating certain investments. Of course, we told him we couldn't discuss anything without your consent. But I thought you should be aware. I thanked him, hung up, and sat very still for a long time. So it wasn't just the house. He had been sniffing around my finances, looking for a way in. It wasn't just arrogance anymore, it was intrusion, and that, I decided, was the final betrayal. I didn't call David to confront him. I didn't storm over to his house or demand an explanation. That's not how you deal with someone who's already shown you who they are. No, the right move, the only move, was to let him keep thinking he was ahead. Because while he was busy trying to figure out how to access what was mine, I would be working on something far more important, making sure that when the time came he would get exactly what he'd earned and nothing more. When I went to bed that night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I had forgiven him, far from it, but because I finally had clarity. The son I had once carried on my shoulders now saw me as a stepping stone. And stepping stones, I knew from years in construction, could be pulled from under your feet without warning. I would make sure the ground beneath David shifted so suddenly he'd never see it coming. Where I'll show the calm, meticulous groundwork the narrator lays before the $50 million reveal shakes his son's world. This is where the slow-burn tension turns into a razor-sharp plan. Revenge, at least the kind worth savoring, isn't loud. It's quiet. It's deliberate. It's built with the same patience you'd use to lay the foundation of a building, one brick at a time, knowing exactly where each will go before you even lift it. That Monday morning, I sat in my study with a yellow legal pad and began to write. Not a letter, not a rant, but a blueprint. Years of running a business had taught me that a good plan leaves nothing to chance. Step one was securing every cent, every asset, so that there would be no accidental access. I called my attorney, a man named Whitaker, who had been with me since the early days of my commercial contracts. He didn't ask many questions, just listened. I want every account placed into a living trust, I said. For tax purposes, he asked. For control purposes, I replied, full discretion to me while I'm alive. Upon my passing, distributions will follow my exact written instructions. He understood immediately. And your son? Not a penny until I say so. Within the week, Whitaker had the paperwork drawn up. The trust included my properties, investments, and liquid accounts. Every piece of my $50 million net worth. I even added a clause that any beneficiary who contested the trust would forfeit their share entirely. Step 2 was appearances. If David and Lauren thought I was a broke old man, I wasn't going to correct them, not yet. In fact, I'd lean into it. I traded in my newer sedan for an older model, one I actually liked better for its simplicity. I started wearing my most worn-in jackets and even patched a sweater sleeve myself. I canceled my club membership and stopped dining at the expensive steakhouse David liked to show me off at. I wanted them to believe their assessment was correct, that I was winding down, shrinking, preparing to pass the baton. It's easier to catch someone off guard when they've already decided you're harmless. Step 3 was information. I reached out quietly to my contacts in banking, real estate, and business circles. People David had never met. I made sure every meeting was off the books, every conversation private. My aim was to shore up my financial position while also setting the stage for a public moment, one that would leave no doubt about the truth. That's when I thought of the bank. My primary accounts were with a private banking branch that valued discretion and service above all. I'd been with them for decades, and the branch manager, Alan, was a man I trusted. I invited him to lunch, at a modest cafe, not the kind of place David would ever imagine holding a serious financial conversation. Over coffee, I told Alan my plan. I want to stage a meeting here at the branch. My son will be present, though he won't know the full reason why. When it happens, I want him to see exactly what I have without me saying a word. Let the numbers speak for themselves. Alan grinned. You want the effect. Exactly, I said. Shock and silence. Then I'll handle the rest. Step 4 was bait. I needed David to walk right into the scenario without suspicion. So I called him the following week and played my role. Son, I began, voice weary. I've been thinking about what you said, about simplifying things. There was a pause on the other end. Yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe I should liquidate some assets, but it's been so long since I handled big transactions myself. I'd feel better if you came with me to the bank. He agreed immediately. I could practically hear the eagerness in his voice. The meeting was set for the following Thursday. In the meantime, I took care of one final detail, Step 5, my will. Whitaker helped me draft a new version, one that left very specific allocations, charitable foundations, scholarships, and trusts for my grandchildren's education. David would still inherit something, enough to live comfortably but far from the empire he believed was already his. And it came with conditions: gainful employment, no debt defaults, and no attempts to access the principal early. I wasn't interested in ruining him. I wanted to redefine him, force him to stand on his own 2 feet. The night before the meeting, I slept soundly, not from spite, but from certainty. I had done everything I needed to do. Tomorrow, David would see the truth, not because I shouted it at him, but because the reality would unfold in front of him with the weight of undeniable fact. And in that moment, he'd realize 2 things. First, that his assumptions had been wrong from the start. And second, that he had misjudged the one man who had been in his corner all his life. The next day, as I buttoned my old blazer and slid my worn leather wallet into my pocket, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For a second, I almost saw myself as David did, a man past his prime holding on to old habits. I smiled. Let him keep seeing that, right up until the very last minute, when I pulled into the bank parking lot and saw David already waiting by the door checking his watch. I felt no anger, no bitterness, just a deep, calm satisfaction. Because the stage was set, the players were in position, and the curtain was about to rise. This will be the longest, most satisfying section, where the $50 million reveal happens in full cinematic detail, and David's confidence begins to crack in real time. This is the emotional peak before his downfall. David was leaning against the bank's glass door when I pulled into the parking lot. He waved, phone in hand, and gave me a smile that was just a little too wide, like he'd been practicing it in the mirror. "Dad," he said, stepping forward to open my car door before I could reach for the handle. "Ready to get this thing started?" I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Let's get it done." Inside, the air was cool, scented faintly with polished wood and expensive paper. The quiet hum of printers and the soft clicking of keyboards felt almost ceremonial. The receptionist greeted me by name, her voice warm. "Mr. Thompson, Allen is expecting you right this way." David glanced at me, impressed. "They know you here?" I smiled faintly. "I've been coming here longer than you've been alive." Allen, the branch manager, stood as we entered his office. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of calm presence that made people feel both comfortable and slightly in awe. "Mr. Thompson," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "and you must be David." David returned the handshake, his tone polite but eager. "Yeah, Dad asked me to help him with some, restructuring." Allen gestured for us to sit. "Of course. I have all the relevant account summaries prepared. But before we begin, Mr. Thompson, I understand you'd like your son to be present for the review." "That's right," I said. "I think it's important he understands the full picture." David leaned forward in his chair, almost rubbing his hands together. "Absolutely. I want to make sure Dad's assets are positioned for maximum benefit." Allen gave the faintest smile and reached for a leather-bound portfolio. He placed it on the desk between us and opened it with deliberate care. The first page was a simple overview. My living trust, a brief outline of my holdings, and a total asset figure printed in bold type at the bottom. $50,437,812. 56. The number sat there, black on white, unflinching. David froze. His eyes darted from the figure to me, then back again. "Wait, what? This is Yours? I met his gaze evenly. Every cent, Alan, ever professional, continued. This includes liquid accounts, investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and business interests. The trust structure ensures full control remains with Mr. Thompson during his lifetime. David blinked rapidly, his voice cracking just slightly. I didn't realize it was this much. I tilted my head. No, you didn't. Alan turned the page, revealing a detailed breakdown. A string of 7-figure accounts, properties with valuations in the millions, dividend histories stretching back decades. Each number seemed to hit David like a physical blow. This property here, Alan said, tapping a line item, has appreciated 320% since acquisition. And the commercial complex in Greenfield continues to generate substantial rental income. David leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence deflating like a punctured balloon. I watched him without gloating, without raising my voice. Silence was the most effective hammer I owned. After Alan finished the overview, he closed the portfolio. Everything is in excellent order. Was there anything specific you wanted to do today, Mr. Thompson? Yes, I said, leaning forward. I'd like to make one adjustment to the trust. David's head snapped toward me. What adjustment? I kept my eyes on Alan. Effective immediately, I want to finalize the charitable allocations and the conditions for beneficiary distributions. The education trusts for the grandchildren should be prioritized. Any residual inheritance for my son will be contingent on specific benchmarks, gainful employment, no outstanding debts, and no early withdrawals permitted under any circumstances. David's mouth opened, then closed again. Wait. Are you saying... I'm saying, I interrupted softly, that you've mistaken my silence for weakness, my restraint for irrelevance. That ends today. The room was so still you could hear the faint ticking of the clock on Alan's wall. I continued, my tone calm. You've spent the past year assuming I had nothing left worth respecting. You've tried to sell my home, pry into my accounts, and decide the fate of what I built without lifting a single brick yourself. You thought you could measure my worth in visible displays. Cars, clothes, dinners at the right restaurants. But what you didn't see was the foundation beneath it all. David swallowed hard. Dad, I didn't mean... Yes, you did, I said, not unkindly. And maybe you didn't think I'd notice. But I did. And I chose not to confront you until I could do it in a way you'd never forget. Alan cleared his throat politely. Shall I prepare the updated documents, Mr. Thompson? Yes, I said, standing, and let's get it done. David followed me out into the hallway, his voice low but urgent. Dad, come on, this isn't necessary. I was just looking out for you. I stopped and faced him. You were looking out for yourself. And now you'll have to learn to look out for yourself in the way I did. By earning it. He stared at me, his jaw tight, a mix of embarrassment and anger in his eyes. So that's it? You're cutting me out? No, I said. I'm cutting you free. We walked out of the bank without another word. That evening I sat in my living room, a glass of bourbon in hand, watching the sun dip behind the trees. I thought about Margaret, about the years of work and the sacrifices we made. I thought about the boy David had once been and the man he'd become. And I thought about the moment in Alan's office when his eyes landed on that number, not out of spite, but because sometimes the truth has to be seen, not told. to be understood. The phone rang just after sunset. It was Alan. "All set," he said. "Documents signed, notarized, filed. The trust is locked in." I thanked him, hung up, and leaned back in my chair. Some might call it revenge. I called it clarity. And clarity, I'd learned, is the most valuable asset a man can own. The next family dinner was at their house. I arrived in my old blazer, same as before. David was polite, overly so, and Lauren, for once, had nothing snide to say. But there was a weight in the air, an unspoken shift. They now knew exactly what I was worth, and more importantly, they knew it was never theirs to take. Where the emotional impact truly lands on David, how his confidence unravels in the weeks following, the subtle but telling changes in his behavior, and the satisfaction of seeing dignity restored without raising your voice once. This is where the consequences quietly set in. The days after the bank meeting were quiet, almost too quiet. No calls from David, no surprise drop-ins, not even a perfunctory "how are you?" text. It was Lauren who broke the silence first. She called one afternoon, her voice honeyed but tight. "Hi, Mr. Thompson. We were wondering, did something happen at the bank the other day? David's been distant." I almost smiled at the choice of word. Distant. That was one way to describe a man whose confidence had been pulled out from under him. "I think your husband can answer that better than I can," I said, keeping my tone light. "But thank you for checking in." Over the next week, I began to notice small shifts. When we did cross paths, at a family gathering or in passing, David was careful with his words. The dismissive comments were gone, replaced with cautious politeness. He no longer interrupted me mid-sentence. He didn't correct my stories or joke about my age. It wasn't humility, not yet. It was hesitation. And hesitation, I knew, meant the mind was replaying a moment it couldn't shake. Word of the bank meeting began to trickle into the wider family circle. Not from me. I hadn't said a word, but from David himself. I overheard him once at a barbecue telling his cousin in a low voice, "I had no idea. He never showed it. I thought—" He didn't finish the sentence. I let him have his unfinished thoughts. They were better left that way. A couple of weeks later, David invited me to lunch. That in itself was unusual. He chose a modest diner, not the sleek, trendy places he used to favor. When I arrived, he was already there, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, not physically, but somewhere deeper. We talked about small things at first, the weather, the traffic, an upcoming local festival. Then he cleared his throat. "Dad, I owe you an apology." I didn't respond, just let the silence do its work. "I've been wrong about a lot of things. I thought you were holding on to the past, stuck in old ways. I didn't realize what you've done, what you built." "You didn't want to realize," I said gently. He nodded. "Yeah, maybe I didn't. It was easier to think I was, I don't know, ahead of you somehow. But I'm not. I've never been. And I guess I've been acting like it was already yours." I finished for him. His shoulders sagged. "Yeah." I stirred my coffee. "David, I worked for decades so you wouldn't have to start from zero like I did. But somewhere along the way, I forgot that giving too much can take something away too. Self-reliance, perspective. You can't inherit those. You earn them." He nodded slowly, staring into his coffee. We talked a little longer about nothing in particular. He didn't bring up money again. Not that day. not since. In the weeks that followed, the changes were subtle but steady. He started showing up to family dinners early, offering to help set the table. He called just to talk, not to discuss ideas or help me get organized. And when we walked to our cars afterward, he walked with me instead of ahead. Lauren was less obvious in her adjustments, but I noticed them too. The thinly veiled remarks disappeared. She asked me questions, real ones, about my past, my work, even my late wife. I answered politely, but I kept my guard up. Trust, once cracked, doesn't repair overnight. And yet, there was a certain satisfaction in watching them both navigate this new reality. They'd expected to step into an empire without lifting a finger. Instead, they'd been shown the gates and told they'd need the key of their own making to enter. I didn't need to punish David beyond that. Life would do the rest. Every time he sat in a meeting and felt the urge to cut corners, he'd remember the day a simple leather portfolio had reminded him of what patience and discipline could build. Every time he felt entitled to something unearned, he'd see that bold number, $50,437,812.56, paired with the conditions that kept it just out of reach. And every time he looked at me across a table, he'd know. The broke old man he'd underestimated had been holding the cards all along. That was enough. More than enough. Autumn arrived early that year. The mornings turned crisp. The maples along my street catching fire in shades of gold and crimson. I found myself walking more, sometimes to the park, sometimes just to the corner bakery where Margaret used to send me for fresh rolls on Sundays. One morning, as I stepped out with a coffee in hand, I noticed David's car pulling into my driveway. He got out slowly, no phone in sight, no rush in his step. "Thought I'd join you for breakfast," he said. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once helped him with his math homework, where he'd once asked me what it meant to be rich. He was 8 then, and I told him wealth wasn't about what you had. It was about how little you needed. That morning he seemed to understand it for the first time. He asked about my latest investments, not with the sly curiosity of someone seeking an angle, but with the interest of a man who wanted to learn. We talked about compound growth, the discipline of patience, and why quick wins rarely last. There was no apology in his words this time. He'd already given me one, but there was respect in his tone, and that was worth far more. When he left, I stood at the door a little longer than usual, watching his car disappear down the street. Something had shifted, not just in him but in me. I'd spent so much energy thinking about protecting what I'd built that I'd nearly forgotten the quieter victories. Seeing a lesson take root, watching dignity return to a relationship where it had been lost. I went back inside, poured myself another cup of coffee, and opened the leather portfolio Alan had handed me weeks before. The numbers were still there, unmoved, indifferent. But they meant something different now. They weren't just a shield against greed or entitlement. They were a reminder of the life I'd lived, the hours I'd worked, the values I'd held on to when it would have been easier to let them slip. That night I wrote a letter. Not to David, not yet. It was to my grandchildren, to be given to them when they were old enough to understand. Wealth, I wrote, is not a number in a bank. It is the freedom to live without fear, to give without resentment, and to leave without regret. If you remember that, you will never be poor. I signed it, sealed it, and placed it in the safe with my will. The next day I went back to living, not watching, not waiting. The trust was in place. My dignity was intact. And my son, well, he'd either grow into the man I hoped he could be or live with the knowledge of the man he'd chosen to be instead. Either way, I'd written the ending to my story myself. And that was enough.